Hey there, do you dare? If you're into true crime, the paranormal, mysteries, and everything in between, check out Do You Dare? It's a podcast where siblings Emily and Kian Dare dive into the cases that fascinate and unsettle them. They take turns picking the stories, true crime, ghostly encounters, unsolved mysteries, and share all the details with each other and you. Plus, you'll hear the occasional cameo from Emily's dog Kylo and his squeaky toy. If you're looking for something intriguing, creepy, and a little bit fun, give Do You Dare a listen wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, come back next week, if you dare.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Down the Crooked Path is researched and recorded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Attawandaron, and the Mississauga of Credit First. This land has been home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and we recognize their enduring connection. We are grateful to share these stories on their lands that carry their histories, and we encourage our listeners to reflect on the past, present, and future of the land they call home. Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian Creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
They say Mr. Christie made good cookies, sweet, golden, comforting, like childhood wrapped in wax paper and tucked into a lunchbox. From the buttery snap of digestives to the delicate crumble of an arrowroot biscuit, his early creations were more than just confections. They were cultural staples. By the late 1800s, Christie, Brown and Company was producing hundreds of varieties, tea biscuits, ginger snaps, and the ever-popular social tea cookies, each one a promise of simple pleasures in a complicated world. But sweetness can be deceiving. Behind the scent of vanilla and the clatter of biscuit tins, there are whispers. Whispers of a room not listed on any blueprints, a room that held more than flour and sugar. Because sometimes the most comforting things, the things we trust, the things we crave, can hide the darkest secrets. This is the story of Mr. Christie's secret room. In the winter of 1848, a 19-year-old apprentice baker stepped off a ship onto Canadian soil, his boots soaked, his fingernails stiff from the Atlantic winds. His name was William Mellis Christie, born in Huntly, Aberdeenshire, Scotland, the only child of John Christie and Jane Grant. He had trained in the art of baking back home, but Canada was something else entirely, a place of raw opportunity and brutal cold. He found work quickly, hired by a baker named William McDonnell in Toronto, earning $4 a month plus room and board. He baked through the night, then pushed a handcart through the muddy streets of Yorkville at dawn, selling bread door to door. The work was hard, the hours long, but the boy had a quiet intensity, something that made people trust him, and something that made his biscuits sell. 2 years later, he left McConnell's shop and joined a bakery run by Alexander Mathers and Alexander Brown. By 1853, Christie had a new partner, George Maver, and had taken over the business entirely. The transition wasn't smooth, and the next few years were lean, the kind of years that make or break a man, but Christie didn't break. By 1856, he had bought out Maver and taken full control and hired 3 assistants. He was 27 years old. In 1858, he entered his biscuits in the Toronto exhibition and won first prize. That changed everything. His name began to circulate not just among housewives and grocers, but among businessmen, men who saw the potential in flour and sugar and egg and handled it with precision. In 1860, Christie formed a new partnership with his father-in-law, James McMullen, and narrowed his focus to biscuits alone. No more bread, no more pies, just biscuits. This was a bold move, but it worked. And the demand grew, and so did the factory. By 1868, Christie had joined forces with Alexander Brown again, this time to merchandise biscuit production. They built machines, they hired workers, they began shipping across Canada. The company became Christie, Brown and Company, and by the end of the decade, it was a name that meant something. The partnership was a delicate thing. In 1879, Christie bought out Brown, quietly, without ceremony, but he kept the name. He didn't need Brown anymore. He had the machines, the recipes, the workforce, and the reputation. But he also had something else, something hard to define. People said that he was meticulous, that he inspected every batch himself, that he could tell if a biscuit was off just by the smell. They said he kept records that no one saw, that he entered a room in the factory nobody entered without permission. They said that he traveled often but never spoke of what he saw. They said he was kind, generous even, but there was something in his eyes, something that made you think twice before asking too many questions. By the end of the century, Christie's factory covered the entire city block. His biscuits were in the homes from Halifax to Vancouver. He had built an empire out of flour and steam. But like any empire, it needed a palace. In 1860, William Christie commissioned the mansion at 25 Queen's Park Crescent West, perched across from the legislative buildings where the city's heartbeat echoed through the streets. Designed by architects Gordon and Hallowell, the home was a statement: red brick, carved wood, stained glass, and a sweeping staircase. It was a place of prestige, built for a man who had risen from apprentice to tycoon. The house stood tall, elegant, and was immaculately kept, with servants moving quietly through the halls and guests arriving in carriages that clattered against the cobblestones. Inside, the rooms were spacious and formal, with high ceilings, polished floors, and fireplaces that never seemed to gather dust. The library was lined with dark wood shelves and smelt faintly of tobacco and old paper. The dining room could seat 20, though it rarely needed to. Servants moved through hidden corridors, ensuring the house ran smoothly without ever being seen. In 1910, the mansion was rebuilt entirely by the firm Darling and Pearson, transforming it into something more modern, more refined, far more private. The new version kept the grandeur, but it added layers of silence, of discretion and control. The walls were thicker, the doors heavier, and the layout far more complex. There were rooms that didn't appear on the original plans, and panels that slid open without a sound. In the summer of 1900, William Christie fell ill. The diagnosis was cancer, and though he had built an empire with precision and stamina, his body began to fail him. He spent his final days inside the mansion that he had commissioned, surrounded by the quiet hum of the household, trained to keep things orderly, even in decline. It was here, within those stately walls, that he passed away in June, and the city mourned. He was more than just a businessman. He was a civic figure, a trustee of the University of Toronto, and a member of the Board of Trade, and the namesake of Christie Street itself. His son, Robert Christie, inherited everything: the factory, the fortune, and the house. Robert was not his father. When William had been methodical and hands-on, Robert was more reserved, more strategic. He didn't inspect every biscuit himself, but he understood scale, expansion, and the value of legacy. Under his leadership, Christie, Brown and Company continued to grow. The factory modernized, production increased, and the brand solidified its place in Canadian households. Robert maintained the company's reputation for quality, but he also introduced effectiveness that allowed it to compete in a rapidly industrializing market. He kept the name, he kept the standard, and he kept the house. The mansion remained a symbol of the family's success, but it also became something else, a place of quiet control. of curated appearances. Robert rarely spoke publicly about the business, preferring to let the product speak for itself. He was known to be generous but private. He entertained guests, but only certain ones. He made decisions quietly and quickly, but never impulsively. Robert Christie didn't just inherit a mansion, he rebuilt it to his likeness. In 1910, he commissioned a complete redesign, stripping away the Victorian flourishes of his father's era and replacing them with a more restrained modern elegance. The new version of the house was quieter, more symmetrical, and far more private. Every room was deliberate, every corridor calculated. It was a home built not for warmth, but for control. And nowhere was that more evident than in the library. The library in the Christie mansion was unlike any of the other rooms in the house. It was quiet, still, and always a few degrees colder than the rest of the home. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany, polished to a deep gloss that reflected the flicker of the fireplace. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books that looked more decorative than read. Thick Parisian rugs softened every step, and the heavy velvet curtains rarely moved, even when the windows were open. Robert Christie spent long hours there, often alone, often after sunset. He claimed it was where he worked, where he reviewed correspondences and balanced ledgers, but no one ever saw him with papers. No one ever heard the scratch of a pen. On the west wall, behind a row of trade journals and legal volumes, there was a panel. It didn't draw attention. It blended perfectly within the woodwork, its edges hidden in the grain. But if you pressed it just right, 2 fingers beneath the spine of a book on the Canadian tariffs, it would release a soft click. Behind it was a narrow passage, and at the end of that passage, a small room. No larger than a walk-in closet, it was lined in red velvet. The floors were bare wood. A single chair sat in the corner facing the writing desk with a green glass lamp. The drawers were locked, keys were never seen. There were no windows, no vents, no sound. This was not a room for reading, it was not a room for guests, and whatever Robert did in there, he never spoke of it. The room itself included a small adjoining bathroom, complete with plumbing. It was designed for long-term occupancy. It was not a storage space, nor a retreat for quiet reading. It was a residence. Robert Christie kept a mistress in this room, and according to accounts referenced by John Robert Colombo's Haunted Toronto book, she lived in the mansion without ever being seen by guests or staff. The arrangement was secret. The room was accessed only by Robert and one servant, whose name was never recorded. The servant was responsible for bringing food to the woman, delivering it discreetly and without question. The meals were prepared in the kitchen, but never served in the dining room. They were carried up the back stairs, through the servants' corridor, and into the library, where the panel was opened and closed without a sound. The woman had everything she needed, except freedom. She had a bed, a bathroom, a desk. She didn't need to leave the room. She didn't walk the halls. She didn't sit in the parlor. She didn't speak to anyone but Robert and the servant. Years passed. At first, Robert visited often, then less so. Eventually, he stopped coming altogether. The servant continued to bring meals, but the woman's condition deteriorated. She became withdrawn, then erratic. The isolation took its toll. According to the legend, she hung herself in the room using a bedsheet tied to the rafters. Her body was discovered by the servant, who informed Robert, who did not report the death. There were no calls to authorities, no record of a coroner's visit, no mention of it in the newspapers. According to the account drawn from local folklore and historical retellings, Robert acted swiftly and quietly. That same night, under the cover of darkness, he and the servant removed the body from what is known as Room 29. They carried it through the mansion's back corridors, avoiding the main hallways and any chance of being seen. No one else in the household was aware, and no one asked questions. The body wasn't taken to a funeral home. It was not prepared for burial in any traditional sense. Instead, Robert allegedly arranged for it to be interred somewhere on the grounds of Queen's Park, the public green space directly across from the mansion. The exact location was never documented. No grave was marked, no name was recorded. The burial was done in secret, without ceremony, without witness. The servant who had been bribed to maintain the arrangement remained silent for the rest of their life. There's no official records of the woman's death. Her identity has never been confirmed, and no missing persons report were ever linked to the case. The secrecy surrounding her presence in the mansion extended beyond her life and into death. The only evidence of her existence comes from oral accounts, architectural records of Room 29, and the persistent legend that has followed the Christie mansion ever since. Robert never spoke of the incident. He continued to live in the house, continued to run the business, and no changes were made to the room. It remained sealed, untouched, and unmentioned. The story of the woman behind the panel was never acknowledged publicly, and the details of her burial remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the Christie mansion story.
Once upon a time, in the land of everyday moments, there lived a sprinkle of magic called icing sugar photography. From sticky cake smash smiles to wind-swept yes moments, they capture the sugar sweet, the beautifully messy, and everything in between. Whether you're a blushing bride or a blooming family, or just want to freeze time for a second, icing sugar photography is your fairy god lens. Visit icingsugarphotography.com and follow along on Instagram at icingsugarphoto. Let your story sparkle, because life is sweet and memories should be too. You. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing. It's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare.
Robert Christie died in 1926 inside the very mansion that had defined both his public stature and private secrets, and in the same home his father had previously died in. He was 57 years old. The cause of death was never clearly documented, although illness had plagued him for months. Some accounts suggest that he had anticipated the decline and made arrangements to protect the family's legacy before passing. 2 years prior, in 1924, he had begun the process of selling Christie Brown & Company to the National Biscuit Company, known today as Nabisco. The sale was finalized in 1928, and it marked the end of the Christie family's direct involvement in the business, but not the end of the brand. Nabisco retained the name and continued to produce cookies under the Christie label, preserving its reputation across Canada. The company's slogan, "Mr.Christie, you make good cookies," became iconic, appearing on packaging and in commercials for decades. Products like arrowroot biscuits, digestives, and social teas remained staples in the Canadian household, joined by newer additions like Oreo and Chips Ahoy, which were branded under the Christie name in Canada. The original Christie factory on Adelaide Street in Toronto eventually sold and was repurposed. By the 1950s, Nabisco had moved operations into a new facility in Etobicoke, which remains active until its closure in 2013. Today, the Christie brand is owned by Mondelez International, a global snack food company that emerged from 2012, split off of Kraft Foods. Though the original factories are gone and the Christie family name is no longer appears on corporate documents, the cookies remain. They are still found on shelves across the country, still wrapped in familiar packaging, still bearing the name of the man who started it all with a handcart and a dream. While the business lives on, the mansion remains. Its walls have changed hands, its rooms repurposed, and its history, both sweet and shadowed, has never quite faded. After Robert Christie's death in 1926, the mansion at 25 Queen's Park Crescent West has sold to the Sisters of St. Joseph for $125,000. The sisters operated both St. Joseph's College School next door and St. Michael's College. The mansion was quietly repurposed to serve their needs. It became a residence for female students attending St. Michael's, marking a shift from private estate to industrial housing. The ornate interior was preserved, but the rooms were adapted for dormitory use, study space, and administrative functions. For nearly 80 years, the building remains in use as student residence. During this time, stories about its past have circulated among students and staff, especially those connected to room 29. The concealed room was discovered by the sisters and converted into a study space, though its original purpose was never officially acknowledged. Its presence has added to the building's mystique. In 2008, the mansion transitioned again, this time becoming the home of Regis College. It's a school affiliated with the University of Toronto. The building's historical features were retained and now serve as a space for academic offices, classrooms, and quiet study. Despite its industrial role, the mansion's layered history, spanning industrial wealth, public scandal, and religious education, remains embedded in its walls. There's a feeling in the house that's hard to name. It settles in certain rooms more than others, especially late in the day when the halls grow quiet and the lights shift against the wood-paneled walls. Some spaces feel colder, even when the heat is on. The library in particular carries a stillness that doesn't quite match the rest of the building. It's not just silence. It's something heavier, something that makes people pause before crossing the threshold. The room behind the panel is still there. It's not sealed off. It's not hidden in any official sense, but it's rarely entered. And those who do find themselves inside often describe a strange disorientation. The velvet-lined walls absorb sound, and the absence of windows makes it impossible to tell how much time has passed. The air is dry, unmoving, and it's easy to lose track of minutes, even hours. There have been incidences where the door has been known to close without warning, sometimes with enough force to startle you. Once shut, it's difficult to open again from the inside, and if no one is nearby, there's no way to call out. The room doesn't carry sound. The phones don't work. You can knock, but it's unlikely anyone will hear you unless they're standing just outside. It's not common, but it's habit. Someone enters, the door closes, and they remain there until morning. And the experience is unsettling. The room is small, silent, and unchanging. There's nowhere to sit comfortably, nothing to do, and no sense of time. It mirrors the story that's been told for decades. The woman kept there unseen, unheard, waiting for someone who never came. No one talks about it openly. There's no part of it in orientation. It's not listed in any handbooks, but the feeling remains. And for those who find themselves inside, even briefly, the past doesn't feel distant. It feels close. The story of the mistress's burial in Queen's Park has persisted for decades, but no physical evidence has ever confirmed it. The account was passed down through oral retellings and referenced in local folklore, suggesting that after her death in room 29, Robert Christie arranged for her body to be removed from the mansion and buried across the street, somewhere on the grounds of Queen's Park. The details are vague, and there are no official documents to support this claim, but the timeline and the geography make it plausible. At the time, Queen's Park was far less developed than it is today. The area was wooded, quiet, and largely unmonitored at night. If Robert intended to conceal the death, the park would have offered a discreet location for an unmarked burial. There were no records of the woman's presence in the mansion, no death certificate, and no missing persons report that matched her description. Over the years, the park has undergone landscaping, construction, and infrastructure changes, but no targeted excavation has ever been conducted to investigate the claim. Without a name, a grave marker, or a documented burial site, there's no way to confirm whether a body was ever placed there. So the story remains part of Toronto's urban legend, rooted in a physical reality of Room 29 and the secrecy surrounding its use. The likelihood of the burial being true lies in the consistency of the accounts and the absence of contradictory evidence. It has never been proven, but it has never been disproven either. The park remains open, public, and unchanged in many areas, and the possibility that someone was buried there in secret continues to linger just beneath the surface. Toronto's skyline tells one story. Its foundation tells another. Beneath the glass towers and manicured parks lies a city shaped by secrets, by whispers, and by rooms that were never meant to be found. It began with cookies. Simple, sweet staples that fill pantries and lunchboxes for generations. Mr. Christie made good cookies, and the name became a household comfort. But comfort can be complicated. The next time you bite into a social tea soft and familiar, remember that even the sweetest things can have shadows. Toronto is a city of urban legends, stitched into its architecture and passed down through quiet conversations. From the tunnels beneath Old City Hall to the locked doors of the Christie Mansion, these stories persist not because they're proven, but because they refuse to be forgotten. Some legends are written in ink. Others are carved into wood, hidden behind panels, and buried beneath the grass. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you loved this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, be sure to check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you loved this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, be sure to check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.
That was an eerie journey down the crooked path with Amanda. How cool was that? If you loved it, don't forget to follow Down the Crooked Path on Instagram and TikTok. Amanda shares some really fun interactive content over there, and trust me, it gets even creepier. Down the Crooked Path is our sister podcast, and you can catch new episodes every Thursday wherever you get your podcasts. So if you're into the paranormal, folklore, and strange little corners of the world, we've got you covered.